The ASME Section 9 conference is headed to beautiful Miami, Florida at the AWS World Headquarters March 12th through the 14th and will be presented by the one and only Walt Spurko. Speaking from my own experience, this is an amazing class. I had the opportunity to attend Walt's class just a few years ago, and he is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to all things related to ASME Section 9. This is a 3-day workshop that will cover compliance with the requirements of ASME Section 9 welding, brazing, and fusing qualifications. For more information on this workshop, as well as other upcoming classes at AWS, head on over to aws.org/events or just click on the link in the show notes.
Arc Junkies presents Weld Wednesday with AWS. Brought to you by the American Welding Society. And now your host, Jason Becker.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Weld Wednesdays with AWS, brought to you by the American Welding Society. Joining me this month is Steve Snyder. Steve, welcome back to Weld Wednesdays with AWS, and welcome to Underground Metalworks.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to be here. I knew that you kind of started this thing up back in the earlier part of the year, and now to be able to be in Orlando and to come by and visit you and actually see what you're doing is pretty impressive, actually, if I may say so myself. It's a combination between having a place to teach, train, and also just a really cool place. I mean, I like the way you've decorated it and the scenery and the walls and it's really nice. I like
Thanks. And that's kind of what we wanted it to be, is an experience. So when you walk through that door, I mean, it doesn't look like much from the outside, but when you come inside, it's kind of like Disney. You can't see the world outside, and it's kind of meant that way. So you walk in here and it's a completely immersive experience when you walk through the door. The artwork, the way that the lab's set up, everything.
No, it flows very well, and I think when you said, when you walk in the front, I was like, oh, wait a minute, he's got a retail area going on here, and bam, now we're into the
Now you
the
go into the
lab.
shop, yeah.
Yeah, very nice.
The cool thing is, we do all the training up front, and then we're setting up the back half to do testing, and, I'm actually, I think on the 15th, we're going through an audit to become an accredited testing facility through the American Welding Society. We just became an AWS educational member this past week, so we're making strides in the right directions.
Yeah, I seen the certificate out front, and nice to know you're going to be an ATF because I think there's maybe only one or two other in the area here.
Yeah, there's very few.
Yeah, okay, good. I think it's a good setup because some of the folks that'll come here will either desire to be tested, or there'll be employers or companies that may want to send their folks over here. So I think you've done real well with this. I'm quite impressed.
Thanks. And that's kind of one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, not just because you were coming into town. Like, I wanted to link up with you anyway, but I was like, hey, while you're here, let's do a podcast. Because you're a hard man to track down. You're working international man of mystery, or international man of inspection, I should say.
Well, yeah, the last, definitely been very busy over in Indonesia, Singapore, Southeast Asia, the last 6 months, and be headed back there the end of this month, actually. And in my role with AWS now, we'll be working to expand those relationships with existing folks and agents we have there, as well as grow our brand and involvement in many areas over there in the Asia Pacific region.
Okay, because you did ATF audits internationally. So ATF, that's the Accredited Testing Facility program through AWS. That's not just a domestic program. That is an international program.
Yeah, I mean, that program, the Accredited Welder Test Facility, and also the Certified Welding Fabricator. As a matter of fact, both ran by our accreditation departments. There's a large majority of our certified welding fabricators are over there, and we do still have several ATFs internationally. I live in Batam, Indonesia, so there's only one on the island there, and that's McDermott, which is, just also happens to be the largest employer on the island. As well. So yeah, they got about 3,500 welders. They don't really require all their welders to go through that, but their welder testing training facility, oh my goodness, maybe 100, 150 booths, 2 stories.
Oh, wow.
And that facility has been, as a matter of fact, that facility has been accredited. I think I audited them at least 15 years ago. So they've held their ATF for quite a long time. And the program's respected over there as well. Again, as you said, and you've mentioned on your other podcast, some employers will accept it. Some are like, hey, that gets you in the door now. Now we need you to test, ISO 9606 or DNV requirements or another standard. But certainly it's recognized, and it's a good program. And I think you've already been through this once, so you should know what to expect.
Yeah, actually, that's when we met the first time. You were the auditor for the last ATF that I set up.
Yeah.
And so I kind of figured, I was like, okay, well, this time it's going to be a little bit easier, for me, because I've already done it, so I don't have, because you don't know what to expect when you walked in. You're like, or when you came in, I wasn't sure what to expect. So I've got my QA manual laid out, which I'd been working on, quite a bit leading up to that. Got material identification for, the materials that are coming through, MIC numbers on the filler metals that we're using, certificates of conformance, made sure everything was calibrated. You made sure I got an equipment maintenance program set up for all my welding machines. Same thing with the test bender jig. All of my equipment, I can certify and calibrate and check and verify and make sure everything's good. But until you actually go through the audit, you really don't know what to expect. I mean, they give you a nice little checklist, and it's like, here's the things we're going to hit. But like, how deep are they going to dig? And it's just like any other inspection. You walk in there, and you're an inspector. I'm an inspector. You walk in, and everything on the surface looks good, but then you find one thing wrong, and then now we got to start digging a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. Very similar to doing tests on a job site. You walk up, and the first couple of welds you check, they're not great. You got to start digging a little bit deeper. What else are they hiding here?
Well, yeah, it's like auditor or inspector's luck. I mean, you start peeling back the onion,
Mm-hmm.
and you get further down into it, and you can kind of see, okay, this is either isolated, right? It's either an isolated condition, or it's a system issue that's prevalent throughout the project or what you're working on. So, yeah, I think you'll do good. I have a sneaky suspicion you'll coast right through it with your experience.
I'm hoping so. I've been running an ATF for the past couple of years. So I'm pretty proficient at testing welders. And then, the AWS came out with the Welder Performance Qualifier endorsement to basically to perform weld testing, I guess, abilities, or, to be able to certify welders.
Well, yeah, I mean, the program actually has been out for about a year and a half now, maybe a little bit longer. And the Welder Performance Qualifier endorsement, I think important to say that eventually underneath the ATF program, which when I say eventually within the next year, will require all ATFs for their test supervisors, whether they're using contractors or on-house or in staff, for them to have the WPQ 1 or Welder Performance Qualification endorsement. And, most CWIs that have years of experience testing welders would probably do pretty well on the exam without a whole lot of preparation. The passing score is 70%. It's 50 questions, which, I think it's 2 or 3 hours.
I think it's a 3-hour test. That surprised me, because I was like, man, it's a 3-hour test. I was telling you, I prepared for it like I was taking the CWI exam, and I walked in and it was 50 questions and I had 3 hours. And then I was freaking out a little bit more. I was like, man, how hard are these questions going to be? But like you said, if you have experience testing welders prior to that and you've done it correctly, you shouldn't have any problem going in to sit for that endorsement, especially like I took the online course. I think it was like 3 or 4 weeks, 2 days a week.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because I wanted to know what I was getting myself into. And
Right.
I think the only time they were actually I prefer in-person training.
Yeah.
But I think the only place they were offering it was like in Arizona, and, trying to set up a new school, while I was trying to set up the ATF, I just didn't have the time to break away from, my school to go out there and take a one week class and then go sit for this exam. So I just kind of had to do it remotely for the online portion that they offered. And it was great. It really prepared me for, what was going to be expected of me on that exam.
Well, and you say what's on the exam, just to talk about that a little bit for your listeners. It does require 70% successful pass rate on that. So you can do the math on how many questions you can miss. And the test specifications basically are broken down into domains, 3 domains, if you will. And the first one occupies 30%, and that covers the qualifier pre-test general responsibilities. Like, what do you have to do prior to the exam to get things ready? From verifying material, verifying the requirements, and then it gets into the equipment and materials required for the testing exactly, and whatever facility requirements that you must have, whether it be bin jig, calibrated welding equipment, calibrated inspection equipment to check the welds. And then it gets into actually conducting the test, which that's about 40% of the exam in itself right there, where you're actually conducting the test itself, the general requirements, the welding variables that are involved, fit up of the test coupons, and then the actual testing requirements, whether they be visual, which obviously visual is required, radiography, and or bin testing, destructive testing. And then it covers, there's probably a question or so on retest and what those requirements would be for retesting of a welder. And then the last domain also occupies 30%, and it gets into the actual post-test activities, if you will. And the post-test activities would include, documentation, the welder performance qualification record, and being able to prepare that properly and interpret the results that are also on that. Now, the actual exam, as I said, I mean, if you're a person that did a pretty good amount of welder qualification testing, you're probably not going to have too much trouble with it. There's a couple of documents, I think, even if you've got a ton of experience, I think that taking a look at the AWS best practices for performing welder qualification test, I think that's a 2019 edition. That's a really good document. It's even good as a reference document to have in your library, even if you don't plan on actually, taking the WPQ1 or you're not an ATF. And then the B2.1 specification for welding procedure and performance qualification. A lot of folks have maybe not worked to that because it's not a construction code, right? However, it would behoove you to be very familiar with that document and understand the requirements for performance qualification. You don't have to waste your time on procedure qualification,
Right.
studying, which is also covered in the document as it's titled, but you definitely need to spend some time. And then also the AWS B5.4 specification for the qualification of welder test facilities would be one. So yeah, those are in a nutshell. I mean, obviously the experience you bring from, if you're working the D11 or other D codes is going to be advantageous to you sitting for the exam.
Yeah, and I think what really helped me along my way is I had really good test proctors, because as a welder, we're tested more than any other profession out there. And so I, especially with, whether it be the union hall or any other place that I was testing, like there's a policy, there's a procedure, there's a step-by-step process that you have to follow. And that's the way that I always taught and did it. Even before I got my CWI, I would do mock testing with my students. I'm like, here, this is what you can expect. Once you go out in industry and get certified, you're going to have specific hold points. Like, I need to see your fit up. Okay, once you got your fit up doc, all set up and everything, like, okay, go fix that piece up in your booth to where it's not going to move. It's going to be stationary, and that's where it's got to stay the entire time throughout the test. And then once you get your root pass in, I need to visually inspect that, or the supervisor needs to visually inspect that root pass. Because if you got lack of fusion or you got other discontinuities or defects in there, I say defects because discontinuities, it's not automatically a defect, not automatically a failure. But if you have defects in there, I need to see that before you cover that up. That test could stop right then and there if you have defects in your root pass. So I need to check that, and then once you get the cap on the piece, I want to go in there and I want to do a visual inspection before we take it down, because once we take that piece down from the test fixture, it's out of play. We're not welding on it. We're not working on it anymore. That's the time it has to go through that, that visual process. And it kind of worked out that I had been trained, as a welder, how to, perform this exam by other people that were doing it correctly. So I think that's what really helped me out. But I know there's a lot of CWIs out there that test welders that may not exactly know the right procedure to do that. I know a lot of welding inspectors out there that just will not certify welders. They won't qualify welders because they don't know the exact process. I've got a good buddy we kind of work together on the same side of, or the different sides of the same coin. He knows all about, NDT testing and all that stuff, and, visual testing, inspection requirements. He does a lot of that work out in the field, but he doesn't really know a whole lot about testing welders. And I'm kind of the opposite. I know a lot about testing welders, but I don't do a whole lot of testing out in the field. Like I've got some stuff from AS&T, visual inspection, dye pen, mag particle, but I really don't have the experience behind that. I've sat through the classes, I've taken the test, but I don't have the hands-on experience with that. So we kind of work on, two different sides of the same coin, because as a CWI, you really don't know everything. A lot of CWIs, they specialize in one area.
Yeah. Yeah, that's spot on. And just to take it one step further, and as we're kind of relating it back to WPQ1 or Welder Performance Qualification Endorsement, to the term right, it's the documentation also, because you could be testing welders for years to D11, and then you go to B2.1, and the essential variables are based upon each process there. And also, you may not realize you need to document, the actual deposited amount of weld metal. If you're doing, two processes, what's the deposit for the first process versus the second? Which one was first? And so that would also determine, what your maximum thickness is. So I think it's very important that any CWI that's testing welder, you really need to be versed in the forms, the recommended forms that are required, and the essential variables, because it varies, right? It varies from D11 to B2.1, to ISO 9606 to D16. So you really need to be familiar with that. And again, if you're not doing it on a regular basis, well, then you need to put some effort into studying and reviewing that prior to you accepting that responsibility to do that. I mean, that's, one of the things when we talk about welder performance qualification and the endorsement, we also have the welder procedure qualification endorsement. And, that there is intended for those individual CWIs or senior CWIs that, very similar to the welder qualification or welder performance qualification endorsement, that have a level of competency to actually write welding procedures, right? A lot of people, think that if you're CWI, yes, that qualifies you to write a welding procedure, or that, and I can understand that, because a lot of people are just not familiar with what, the B5.1 or the QC1 documents that govern the CWI programs say. And furthermore, you made a good point on your last podcast about the employers don't know, right?
Yeah, that seems to be one of the biggest disconnects.
Well, yeah, they don't know that they don't know. So that makes it a little more hard to navigate for manufacturers and fabricators that, they're not going to dissect the B5.1 qualification standard and see that, wait, writing welding procedures is intended, for a senior CWI. However, it's no matter what, it's just like the application of the weld procedure, like you said in a recent podcast on testing. It's the onus falls upon the employer, right, to verify that person and confirm that person can do the tasks that are outlined, for example, in B5.1 Table 1. It's not to say that a person, if it is not capable and competent because they're not, say, a senior CWI, but that onus falls upon the employer to verify that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we were talking about that earlier. There's certain things that, can I do it? Yes. Am I competent enough to do it? Yes. Is it, at the end of the day, my responsibility to do that? Does the onus fall on me? Well, it could at the employer's discretion.
Absolutely. And that's the message that needs to get across, I think, to many employers. You brought up a really good point recently, too, on the requirements of ASME Section 9 and QG 106, which, I'll be quite honest with you, there's a lot of companies right now kind of getting dinged on that by their AIs. It's starting to come up as a nonconformance because they're not involved with that part of the process. Or let's say, for example, they don't have written into their quality management system that they accept ATF qualification. They should be involved with that. It falls back on the organization. So yeah, there's, the old saying, the devil's in the details, right? I mean, it really is when you get into codes and standards and reviewing those and understanding how they apply to welder performance qualification and welding procedure qualification. So, you made the comment about welders being tested. I often laugh at that. I mean, as an NDT level 3, I mean, I'm tested less than the welder making the weld, but I'm the guy checking the weld.
Right.
So yeah, we are tested more than any other trade that I've ever came across in proficiency and consistent, continued consistent performance, as you maybe.
I do like the welder performance qualifier endorsement. I mean, that was definitely an additional feather in my cap. But it also verified that I was doing things correctly. To an extent, I wasn't documenting near as much as I should have been. Just, like I said, I would administer these tests with my students, not to certify them, but just to kind of like, hey, here's the process. This is what you're going to go through when you go through an actual certification. Because we would do everything through a third-party company. But, just the hold point. So I think the biggest thing was, especially when it comes to that test, is understanding and being able to navigate the routing sheet. All the different hold points. I think the bulk of, what that endorsement taught me was everything's got to be documented step by step. And the routing sheet is, more often than not, I think a lot of the questions came off of the routing sheet. So being able to understand that, navigate, and fill out that routing sheet is going to be a huge advantage to somebody that, goes to administer or take that test.
Well, yeah. And obviously it's a record, right? I mean, you have the welder performance qualification record. However, the routing sheet is basically a cradle to grave, if you will, record of what happened from the time the welder, arrived to checking the ID, to reviewing the PPE with the welder, to going over the weld procedure. And all of that's included in there and checked off. I mean, you made sure the die's the right diameter and the plunger for the bend jig, the
distance from center to center, like all that.
Yeah. The devil's in the details. And if you just have only for example, let's say an ATF, you'll have that record, I think, for what, 5 years?
Yeah, it's 5 years.
So, I mean, if there's any reason to question a particular, let's call it a welder performance qualification record, there's really a whole trace backward option for any employer or organization to go back and say, well, wait a minute, how did you really qualify that? I know it says what you did, and these are the ranges, and these are the variables, and this is what John can do. But again, it's a very, very detailed audit trail. And quite honestly, if you are dealing with a very critical welding project and a customer, it's not unusual for them to send a customer rep or third-party inspector to verify that the welder qualification testing's being conducted properly, right? There's some state DOTs that have the AWS ATF program written in to their DOT book of specifications in structural steel. So, it's a very important, the checklist. I think the router itself also triggers you like, oh, yeah. Oh, man, I never really looked at that before. The grinding direction of my coupons. Oh, is my plate the right rolling direction?
Yeah, that's a big one.
All these welds just failed everybody and they're good welders, but I've seen it happen.
Oh, yeah. That's why I switched from buying 3-inch flat bar and beveling that side to switching to 6-inch and cutting it, long ways or widthwise and beveling it that way, because the rolling direction matters. But if you don't, and that's actually listed in D11, but if you've never ran across, you don't know what you don't know.
That's right.
You see, okay, the coupons are 3-inch by 6-inch. Okay, yeah, we'll just buy some 3-inch flat bar. We'll cut them up into 6-inch coupons and bevel it and, weld it up. And more often than not, it'll pass. But sometimes you'll have a failure in the base metal.
Well, and I can remember years ago that's testing some welders, and these were crackerjack welders, man. Everybody failed, and everybody's standing in the shop looking at me. And you know what it's like. You have a group of iron workers that just failed a bunch of exam, and hey man, we've been running inner shield in our 32 forever. Don't tell us we don't know how to run it. And you're like, well, this bin test coupon says maybe you don't. And That wasn't the case. It was actually the material. So very important, the router, how it's used, how it's applied during the testing operation, and then again having that as a post welding record, if you will, to trace backward to check out anything. And even if they failed, right? I mean, you still have that router, you still have that record, why they failed. They exceeded the maximum discontinuities allowed in the bin face, and you have that. And I can remember one time where years ago, we had the department at a particular young lady complained that she had failed the test and it wasn't fair, and there were some things like that. We actually had the Department of Labor came in and actually came to our facility, and we had kept the coupons and we had kept the results, and we had that all on file. But there was a complaint filed, and in that case, we had a record of everything. We had the router, we had the bin coupons. Didn't necessarily need the bin coupons because we had the router. But in that case, it was kind of like, okay, we get it. She needs to retest.
Mm-hmm. So. Well, I think that's the best part about the documentation, especially like the routing sheet, having the QA manual. Everything has traceability all the way back to what base metals were used. Where were those procured from? What are the heat and lot numbers off of those? Was it the correct material that was being used for the required testing? What about the filler metals? Did you have the correct base metal to filler metal combination? How, let's see the welding procedure specification. I mean, there's an entire packet that goes along. You don't just walk in, weld up a test plate, look at it, cut it up, bend it, and say, hey, here's your cert. I mean, there's a lot that actually goes into it. So you have entire traceability. So if that welder goes off and performs a bad weld somewhere, they're like, well, where did you test? How did you get certified? Well, we tested over here. We got certified. Okay, they come over here. Here's the base metal that was used. Here's the certificate of conformance for the filler metal that was used. Here's the welding procedure that was actually used. Here's the results of the bend tests, or the radio, whatever the required testing is, because based off of that WPS or whatever code they're working to, the inspection requirements are going to be a little bit different. But if you have all that documentation, all that information, same goes if you have a welder that they come in and let's just say they're not having a really good day, and they might have welders have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder sometime, myself included, but they come in here and they put a bad. They've been known,
Yeah, right.
There's a bit of a stereotype, but but they come in and they put in a bad weld and they leave and they're like, I know that was a good weld. That inspector just doesn't like me, or they're trying to make more money off of me. Okay, well, like I think in my QA manual, I'm required to keep those coupons for 90 days. So if you want to file a grievance with AWS, you can call them up. You can come down here, send in a third party auditor, and say, here's the coupon. Here's what the requirements we're testing to, and it's probably not a bad idea to either. Even after 90 days, when I can throw those coupons out, it's probably not a bad idea to document those with photographs prior to disposal. So if a weld comes in and say, yeah, they had excessive weld reinforcement, here it is in the photo, that's their welder numbers right there on the plate. I can show that. I can back all that stuff up. Or, if I do have the coupon on site, I can say, here's the weld sample that they produced, take a look at it. Would that pass? So it's also a little bit of a security blanket for the ATF as well.
Yeah, and you can always use it for a wall example. For as my welding instructor used to do, we had the crappy coupons over here. This was Heartbreaker, and then the good ones were over here, Dream Maker.
There you go.
So it was like, you're either going to be a Heartbreaker or a Dream Maker, and again, it's you're right. I mean, it's not that much effort really to do that and make sure that again, there's a cradle to grave record of what happened, how it was tested, if it failed, if it passed, why it failed as well.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things I want to set up here at our ATF is have, like a display table and have like Hall of Fame and Wall of Shame type thing. And just, that way when a welder comes in and says, I think I'm good enough, I can walk them over and say, this is visually, because a lot of welders are visual people. This is what I'm looking for. And if this is what you're producing, you may need some additional training. You might need, some more time under the hood before you come back in here, because it can be a big expense to come in and say, I want to be a certified welder. There's a lot of time, documentation. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. So before you go out there and waste your money,
Yep.
I want to show you exactly what I'm looking for as far as, uniform weld profile. And that's one of the things that I talk to welders about all the time when they come in and say, here's what I'm looking for. This is what I'm looking for on your root pass. So it's not a surprise. This is what I'm looking for on the root pass. I really don't need to see what you do between the root pass after I inspect it and the cap. That's between, you, the booth, and your plate, right? Just know that if you hide something, we're going to find it.
Yeah. If I hear that grinder burning up over there,
Exactly.
I'm coming over.
or I mean, that could be another variable with that WPS. Are you allowed to use a grinder?
Yeah.
So,
If you're a bridge welder, I mean,
you're not. No power tools.
You better be chipping if you're a D15 and chipping and brushing.
But that's exactly what I try to go over with the welder that's coming in to do a certification and say, this is what I'm looking for when it comes to, the cap. The visual inspection that I do on the final, it's got to be above flush, below an eighth, depending on what code I'm testing to. Uniform bead profile, I try to go over all of that information with them before they step into the welding booth. That way they kind of know what's expected, what they need to produce, before they turn that plate in.
Well, I mean, everything we've been talking about here this is what we expect of the test supervisor as the American Welding Society when, we evaluate an ATF. But we expect that they have this knowledge and they're applying this knowledge through the testing process. And, that's one of the requirements. As I said earlier, I think that all ATFs, if they haven't already, they should be selecting that individual, that qualifier, test supervisor that they plan on working with, or they have on staff already, and going ahead and getting them up to speed on the weld performance qualification endorsement. Again, if you're already a CWI, this is, you sit through what, 3 exams, 2 hours long. So you already know what the exam side of things are. And, let's face it. I mean, this is no step for a stepper if you've already been involved in doing it. And if you haven't, then obviously, like yourself, probably ought to take the online training or in person and spend a couple of weeks or a month or so reviewing the documents we mentioned and just making sure you're up to speed on it. Again, don't focus on procedure qualification when you crack open the B2.1, but focus on the things me and you've talked about here and again, the best practices document, really good document. I think the router's in there, isn't it?
I think they have a sample in there. Yeah, and you have the ability to custom. It's like anything else, as long as the essential variables are listed, you can add other things. If you want to have different hold points in there, for more clarification or a little bit stringent policy, you're free to do that. You just got to have the bare minimum stuff that's required in there. But
Right.
yeah, there's like a sample document in there, and I think one of the biggest reasons that I took that endorsement is, number one, it satisfied the requirements of my 9-year certification.
No, that's important.
For the research. So I was like, cool, if I don't have enough PDHs, which I think I do enough seminars and conferences and all that stuff to stack up those hours. But let's say I fall short because, work or something like that. Well, an endorsement automatically, satisfies the requirements for my 9-year. But I was also testing welders, so why not go ahead and get an endorsement that says I'm certified to test welders? It just made sense, especially, operating an ATF. And I think at some point, it's going to be a requirement as, somebody running an ATF to have that endorsement, which
Absolutely.
it just makes sense. You need, if you're going to certify people, you need to be certified to be able to do that type of work. You need to, somebody has to test your knowledge and ability to be able to perform that work. Otherwise, who's saying you're actually doing it correctly,
Well, you're right. I mean, some do it correctly, some don't. And as we've said 2 or 3 times here, some don't know that they don't know. And that's the most dangerous part when you're qualifying welders and issuing documentation. And the last thing you need or want is, for this welder to be told you can't work today. Well, why not? Well, because your qualification documentation is incorrect, or it's missing something, or maybe it's not the right range of thickness qualified that we need. So it's very important to get it right the first time.
Yeah.
And,
And that's kind of why I put that episode out the other, couple weeks ago about, what you need to know about welding certifications. Because a lot of people, they get tested at school by their instructor and they walk out and they're like, I'm an AWS certified welder. Okay, you might have met the requirements of an AWS test, but you also need to know your limitations. Let's say you even went through an ATF. Everything was done correctly. It was all documented correctly. Heat numbers, lot numbers, certificates of conformance, position, everything was verified, everything was calibrated, everything was good. You need to know the range of your qualification. because if you go in there and test on 3/8 plate, you can't go out in the field and start welding on 1-inch plate. There's a range of your qualification. It doesn't certify you from one process to the next. So saying you're AWS certified, that's one cert, maybe one or two positions. I mean, you really need to understand the range that you're qualified, and your employer really needs to understand that more especially. But as the welder, you do too, because let's say if I'm certified, I go get a certification for, we'll just use 3G because that's the most common. If I get a 3G cert and I go out and on the job site and the foreman's like, hey, I need you to go tie in all those overhead welds out there. Well, I'm not qualified to do that with my certification.
But they're only fillet welds, sir.
Exactly. But the welder needs to understand that, because the welder can get in trouble because if they don't know their limitations and they go out there and perform that work, they're not really qualified to do that.
Exactly right.
And the company needs to know that too, so they're not, putting people in compromising positions. And a lot of people are like, well, if I don't go out there and do that, I'm going to lose my job, so I have to go out there and do that. Well, if you're not qualified to do that work, don't do that work. But then as an employer, understand those limitations as well, so you're not putting your employees in jeopardy. Or you can get them skilled up, trained up, and certified to be able to perform that work and maintain compliance.
It's funny you bring that up, because we were just talking before the podcast. We were hanging out here in the shop, and we were talking about all the structural steel jobs we've been on, and the deck welders. You get the guy over welding moment connections, and the next thing he's welding the deck down to the joist, and you're like, whoa,
wait a minute.
Wait a minute. Yeah, blows through once or twice, and you're like thinking, wait a minute, there's no D13 qualification over here, or any of that. None of that happened, and that happens a lot. Where someone says, "Oh well, if he's certified to do this, even though it may seem on the surface easier to weld deck to bar joist, for example,
it's not.
It's not. It's not.
I can attest to that.
Yeah, it's not." So yeah, that's a good example. I've seen that happen several times. And like you said, well, I'm over here welding on this carbon steel pipe, and then they moved me over here. And they want me to go over here and weld on this nickel chromoly pipe, or they want me to weld on this stainless. It's got to be supervised. It's got to be monitored. And that's on the other end of the spectrum, right? Yeah. On the job site. Like you said, there's guys that are really good and gals that are really good at site inspections and quality control that don't know the qualification side, and then vice versa. I wouldn't expect someone that works at a test lab doing welder qualifications all day long to go to the field and be able to perform optimally and, write weld procedures and do those type of things.
Mm-hmm. So. Well, you brought up deck welding. I thought, because I have a client that want to get certified in deck welding probably in the next couple of months. They're putting their procedures together. One of the things I found interesting is most code books that you work with, it's twice the thickness that you test on, but not when it comes to sheet metal. So if they qualify on 22 gauge decking, that's all the thickness they're allowed to do. If they go up or down in thickness, that's a whole different test.
Yeah, I mean, over the years, it's been a lifetime ago qualifying the D91 and D13, so I don't recall all of them, but I can remember years ago doing it and going, oh, wow. Oh, yeah. Well, wait a minute. I didn't know that. You got to do another spot weld for that. Mm-hmm. Oh, you got to have it. Oh, it's got to be 5/8 diameter puddle weld. And you got to do, this gauge doesn't. And then through paint.
Yep.
Or coating.
Coating is completely different too.
It had to be considered totally different. So, there's little things like that. You think, it's not like, the guy can weld the moment connection. He ought to be able to go out there and, do a 22 gauge deck weld.
Yeah.
And that.
That's just simply not the case. I mean, it's good to be proficient in all those different codes, and that's why, if I'm talking to somebody, like, I typically don't cite the code unless I have the code in front of me. I try not to go off memory, just because I work in so many different codes. If I were to tell you, oh yeah, it's twice the thickness, well, that's something I'm remembering from like a D11 or a D12 that doesn't apply in D13. So I like to have the code book right in front of me and say, okay, here's the essential variables, and I'll be dang, that's actually different.
Well, you brought up again something we were talking about offline, and different codes and standards. Don't memorize it. You're very right about that. We started talking about ISO standards and welder qualifications, and I showed you it's a totally different language. I mean, The processes are referred to by numbers, and the positions are not 3G, 4G. They're
No, it's
PA,
a number and a
PG.
letter designation that and it doesn't make sense.
And, I worked with it for, you can't work one way for 30 years. And then even though I spent over 10 years doing that, working to the ISOs, still had to look this stuff up. Like, oh, wait a minute. There's a different number for single wire subarc versus tubular subarc welding process. So yeah, don't ever try to memorize the code, folks. It doesn't work.
No, because even in the 6006, the shielded metal arc welding, I think it's code 111.
111.
Whereas with AWS, it's SMAW. So it kind of, it's just different because SMAW doesn't necessarily translate internationally. Because it's almost an acronym. So shielded metal arc welding. Well, it's what manual metal arc welding in some parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, you've got process 131 under ISO 9606 is a metal inert gas MIG welding, where 135 is metal active gas welding. Versus
GMAW, which encompasses both of them.
And if you can't remember 131 or 135, like I couldn't, which we didn't use much MIG mag welding, but again, like I said, it's totally different, right? It's a totally different setup and scenario, and you have to refer to your codes and standards, and the brain just gets populated, right? You got to push some stuff out and purge it to make room for some new code information to get in there. And that's what's fun about this industry and this field. And, I mean, it's always a challenge. There's always something to learn. No one knows it all. No one will ever know it all. And it really, for folks like us, it kind of keeps you
sharp.
Yeah. I mean, you're like, oh, wait a minute. I didn't know that. I mean, I learn something every week, every single week. Like, oh, I didn't know that, and that's what keeps it real, keeps it fun, and keeps it interesting. And, that's why we do what we do. And most people that are in welding, you either love it or you hate it. And if you hate it, you're not in it very long, right?
Yeah.
And if you love it, well, then it's your career, right? And you do it forever.
Yeah. And I like those little challenges. It's kind of like, it's the same thing when you have an issue with the welding machine, you're troubleshooting. Like I like it when a piece of equipment goes down. I mean, I don't because it slows down production, but I like going in there and figuring these things out and troubleshooting. And it's the same thing working with, different companies with codes and standards. They're like, hey, we need to certify our welders to this, that, and the other. Okay, cool. This is a material that I'm not used to working with. This is a code that I'm not used to working with. And then you jump in there and you're constantly learning the whole time, flipping back and forth. It's kind of like a game, and I like playing the game. It's many people that don't like playing the game, like you said, they don't last long doing it. But I like, grabbing a big table and 5 or 6 code books and specs and this, that, and everything, because they're all referring you in circles to come up with this answer. Because like I was talking about studying for the CWI exam, you can't just open the book and read it from front to back and just understand that. You really have to go into that code book with a question, with the intent of finding an answer. That's how you navigate these code books. So anytime I get a new question that I'm not familiar with, I love that. And it's like, oh, cool, I get to go on a little scavenger hunt,
Yeah, and it's a challenge, and that's the one thing. It was funny. I was having a conversation the other night with some folks, and we were talking about different industries we worked in, and it's like some people work in the same industry forever, and that's great and that's good. But when you've worked in multiple industries and been exposed to multiple different types of construction and fabrication, it's almost like you're thrown in it and you have to learn it, right? Mm-hmm. Now, again, I made that decision to do that and move on to the next and the next. But it really does give you a different perspective, because the way they do it in aerospace is not the way they're erecting steel, and the way we're doing it in a nuclear environment is not the way we're doing it in fabrication of trailers. So there's always a challenge. There's always something to learn. And like I said, I think that's what keeps you sharp and keeps you motivated.
Yeah. It's never the same thing over and over again. That's kind of why I like it. I like being thrown a curveball every once in a while. It's fun. I mean, it changes things up, because I get bored doing the same mundane task. And I think that's kind of why I like doing the school, because, okay, I get to train people. And if I feel like I'm getting burnt out on that, I can go over here and I can certify some people. If I'm getting burnt out on that, I can do some inspecting, and then I can go back and I can do a little bit of training and a little bit of testing, and I get to bounce around a lot.
Dude, you got it set up here. What do you mean? I mean, you're right. You can go over there and play around on your plasma cutting table for a while and
and go
make
do some fabrication,
ornamental iron. Yeah, do metal art training with a group. Do real critical weld training on. Yeah, you've got it set up here. I'm really, really impressed, and I'm so glad that I got this time in my schedule to come by and visit with you and hang out a little bit.
We haven't had a chance to chat because you're on several different time zones. So I never know when to hit you up.
Just
see you
remember,
once in a while
it's
on
always
LinkedIn.
it's typically 12 hours in the future.
Okay.
So 12 hours in the future, just look at your clock and say, oh, well, it's 8 p.m. It's 8 a.m. He should be up.
Okay.
Actually be up around 5:36. So, but yeah, it's always 12 hours in the future. I like to tell folks that, if you want to know what's going to happen tomorrow, give me a call.
I'm going to have to, especially when the winning lottery numbers come out.
Yeah, right. Yeah, good.
Well, great, Steve. It's been an absolute pleasure. Anytime we get to hang out and kind of nerd out on welding codes and specs and everything, I really appreciate your time. And it's always a pleasure chatting with you.
I appreciate it, and looking real forward to the Fab Tech coming to Orlando.
Are you going to be back for that?
I will be back for that. Yes, I will be back for that. So hopefully we'll have a little reunion during that, and we'll have some more time to kind of hang out and, get caught up.
Oh, for sure.
Socialize a little bit.
We're already planning out we've been working with Nicole with AWS about planning out the Arcs and Ales event, so that should be good as well.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So it'll be a good time to catch up and network and, talk some more weld nerd stuff.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Jason, for having me.
Oh, my pleasure.
Enjoyed it.